Thank you, Aaron, for reading the scriptures for us, and for Chris for preparing that hymn for us to lead us into worship. After my sermon, there'll be some links below that will lead you into some more time of worship to help flesh out what God is going to be stirring up and hopefully leading you in. We're in the midst of a new series. This series is called Finding Comfort. We've just started it right after Easter, and we sent out a reading guide for it. So you might have that already, but if you don't, it'll be in the links below, and I encourage you to check those out. They take you through different stories and psalms in the scriptures of the experiences we go through life and how God can come into the midst of that. As I was driving along Dutch Village Road the other day, I had this sense as I saw people walking around and standing apart that maybe not everyone, but there are many in the world that are afraid. There are people that are afraid. We're not quite sure what to do. Sometimes we don't know what to believe, and we're scared. And sometimes when you're scared, you want to hide. Well, when I was young, one of my favorite games to play was hide and seek. It's not a game you hide because you're scared, it's hiding. It's part of it. You hide and you want to be found. And I may have shared this story with some of you before, but one of the stories that comes back to me is these two young boys on our block, Warren and Stuart. They were playing hide and seek with us one time, and we were looking everywhere for them, and we couldn't find them at all. And it turns out that they had gone home, and we kind of gave up later on. We never knew they went home, but they just decided to go home and hang out together. I got so good at playing the game hide and seek that when I became a camp counselor and we did a hide and seek with the campers, that I don't know, maybe I'd find too good a hiding spot, but I was hiding up by a visible tree, which I thought was visible enough, and I couldn't get seen, and they kind of called the game without me. So I met up with everyone in the chapel, and they're like, "Where were you?" And I said, "Well, I was just up in a tree, just right at the edge of the path there." And someone they said, "Well, we didn't see you, so we just decided to come in and call the game." So I felt strange because I hid, but I wanted to be found, which is kind of an odd thing with hide and seek. You want to hide, but sometimes you want to be found as well. And when it comes to our faith, our life, sometimes we want to hide from people. We want to hide from God. And sometimes hiding from God is quite difficult. He sees us. He always sees us. We think we're hiding, but we are not. But there are other times where it's not hiding, but we feel unseen by God. I don't know if you've ever felt like that, where you feel as though God isn't aware of what's going on in your life, can't see you, doesn't quite follow you, isn't aware of your daily dealings. And today we're going to deal with that question that if God is real, then why am I going through all this? If God can see me, why is this happening? If God can hear me, why does it look like He's not doing anything? And so we're going to look at a story from Genesis, which starts with the story of Hagar in chapter 16, and then it picks up again in verse 21. And as I was preparing one of these books that I came across, it was off my bookshelf, and I think it belongs to my wife. It was Life Principles from the Women of the Bible, Book 2. And one of the things I just found, and it's kind of ironic for me talking about this too, but in this book, all the authors are men, which just makes me chuckle. However, the book is dedicated to Kay Arthur, who they call a devoted friend and a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, a modern example of a woman God is using to do good work in His kingdom. Here, one who teaches grace and truth. But in this book, the first woman that they teach on as a man, and just as I'm going to do this morning, but the woman they teach on is Hagar, this Egyptian woman. And Hagar came to my mind. I thought, what an unfortunate name, and what an unfortunate woman. Unfortunate name because when I think of Hagar, the first image that comes to my mind is that old comic Viking, Hagar the Horrible. If you remember, I remember reading the Saturday comics from the Toronto Star growing up, and he was a slob, a drunk, a doofus, this all-around kind of not great guy. I think he may have been a husband, I can't really remember, but if he was, I don't remember him being a great husband. So Hagar didn't really have a good name because the name was Hagar the Horrible. Well, Hagar in the Bible was also an unfortunate woman because she was caught in the middle of two of the most important people in the Old Testament, Abraham and Sarah. It's the story of a woman who seems to have everything okay in her life, and then she meets some strangers and becomes a servant or a slave, depending on your translation of the Old Testament. And to people who seem to have everything going for them, she becomes a servant. Abraham and Sarah had everything, and it appeared that nothing could go wrong in this family. She was in a family that had everything they could ever have wanted. And even if Hagar was a servant, she was a servant among many servants. But she became the first personal servant of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And in this family, the Bible says that they have an abundance of sheep and goats and cattle and donkeys and camel and silver and gold and land for it all. What that family didn't have, though, was children. Well, the story starts in Genesis chapter 12, when the Lord appears to Abraham, then called Abram, and God tells him to leave his country, his relatives, his father's home, and journey to a new land where he would be blessed. And anyone who blesses him will be blessed, but anyone who curses him will be cursed. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. So Abraham leaves his homeland and settles in the land of Canaan. Well, after some time, famine came to the land. So they heard of food down in Egypt, much like the story of Joseph. And Abram and his wife, who went by Sarai back then, they went to Egypt. And during their time in Egypt, some difficult things happened, which you can read in Genesis chapter 12. But in the end, Abram and Sarai leave Egypt with even more than they arrived with, including a young Egyptian woman named Hagar. And everything seemed to be all right. Life went on and time went on, and Abram and his wife were doing all right. But by the time you get to chapter 15 in Genesis, Abram starts getting concerned. He's worried because he has no kids. And if he dies, all his land will pass to someone who's not in his family, but one of his trusted servants. So the Lord makes him a promise in chapter 15, verse 4, that Abram will have a son of his own, and his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And that promise settles Abram for a while. But when you get to the beginning of chapter 16, you see that Abram and his wife still have no children. But by this time, it's as though Hagar has become this favored servant to Sarai. So much so that in a family with so many servants, she's the one who's mentioned by name. And a plan starts to form which would seem to solve this problem of Abram having a child. And Sarah states, "It's the Lord that has been preventing me from having children." So she suggests Abram to sleep with her servant Hagar. Perhaps she can have children through Hagar. And Abram agrees with his wife Sarai's proposal. And though to our 21st century ear this sounds completely absurd and repulsive, that Hagar is even being proposed without her consent to be a surrogate for Sarai. But during these times it was completely normal. You see, Abram and Sarai and Hagar would have grown up being familiar with what we call the laws of Hammurabi. It was this law code that people in the area of Mesopotamia would have learned in their youth. They had schools, they had teachings back then. And these law codes allowed for things like this to happen. Remember, this is taking place in the Bible before Moses, before Israel, and servants were just the legal extension of their mistresses. Any children that would have been born to them would be part of the family, so this option makes perfect sense in the legal sense. Maybe not in the spiritual sense, but in the legal sense, it was completely okay. So Abram goes along with this, and he takes it one step further. He makes Hagar his wife in chapter 16, verse 3. And from this new marriage, Hagar becomes pregnant. And one of those things that happens when a woman became pregnant during this time in human history, she would gain honor. Women in the ancient world could gain honor in two ways. One, by getting married, and the second, by having children. But Hagar's honor quickly turned to contempt. The text says that shortly after her pregnancy, she started to despise her mistress Sarai. She held her in contempt. We don't know why, but we can only speculate. Perhaps it's because Hagar had no input in this whole thing. Perhaps she was worried what would happen to her child. Perhaps she wanted the child to be her own and not belong to Sarai and have Sarai claim her. We don't know the reason. But the way Hagar saw Sarai actually was beyond contempt. Hagar moved into an area that she might not have known had drastic consequences for her, because the word translated despise is the same word that's translated curse in chapter 12. Sarah was cursed by Hagar. Sarah, the wife of Abram, the wife of the one who God promised, whoever curses you will be cursed. But maybe a servant girl didn't know that promise. And what happens next is Sarah begins to fume. She begins to boil with rage, and she turns to Abram and says, which is translated in the New Living Translation, she says to him, "This is all your fault. I put my servant in your arms, and now she's pregnant, and she treats me with contempt. She curses me, and the Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me." Another translation has it that this has been a wrong that has been done to me. And it seems like a combination between a wrong that has been done to me by God, by Hagar, and by Abram, as though all three had been conspiring against her in this statement. You ever feel like that? And she says, "May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord show you who's wrong, you or me." It's another way of saying, Abram, either she goes or I go. And Abram, like the doofus in a TV sitcom, just shrugs his shoulders and says, "Oh, well, she's your servant. Why don't you do what do you think is best? Deal with her as you see fit. Do what's good in your sight, Sarai. It's up to you. She's your servant," even though she's also Abram's wife. And so Sarai does just that. And to answer the question, either she goes or I go, it's, well, she goes, obviously. But the thing is, the first wife can't just drive another wife away from the home, even if she was the first wife. And it's here the Bible leaves us to some imagination, but the words that are used are not pleasant. It says that Sarai treated Hagar harshly. She abused her. She allowed her jealousy and the class differences between the first wife and a foreign Egyptian slave to fill her with hatred towards Hagar. The one who has been cursed curses back, and her treatment was so harsh that, likely in the fear for her life and the life of her unborn child, Hagar flees towards her home country of Egypt. And on the way to Egypt, this pregnant Hagar is resting beside a spring, and for the first time ever in the Bible, we're introduced to a character called the angel of the Lord, this divine messenger of God. She probably didn't know who it was, but this angel of the Lord knew who she was. And the angel calls Hagar by name and says, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going?" She simply replies, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." Doesn't want to get into it. "I'm running away." And then the messenger, the angel, sets before her an option. Stay here in the wilderness, stay here in the desert, and it will end. Or go back to Sarai and submit to her, become her servant again, and you will have a child. You will have many descendants, and when your son is born, you will name him Ishmael, which means God hears. Because the Lord has heard your distress, he has seen your cries of affliction, He has seen the abuse that Sarah has done to you. He hears you, and he's calling you back to know him more. What we may not realize is the angel replies to her in a response that restores and forgives someone who's cursed God and who God has set apart. Now, I don't really like this part of the story myself, just in a personal sense, because I want Hagar to be the hero. But even she has some fault. She didn't know that she cursed the one who was set apart by God, or she might have, but she needs some turning back. And that's hard, because he's saying, go back to your abuser. But go back, trusting that the Lord will guard you and protect you. And in turning back to Sarai and Abraham, she turns back to God, trusting him for the situation and trusting his will for herself and her child. And it's here that Hagar enters into a moment of worship, a moment of spiritual awakening, a moment where she sees God, the God she's been hearing about in the home for 10 years, as a God who also belongs to her. And so she calls God a name, El Roi, or El Roi. You are the God who truly sees me. She's amazed, and she says, I've truly seen the one who sees me. And in the well that she's standing beside, this spring of water in the wilderness, she gives this well a name, and the people around it gave it the name, the well of the living one who sees me. Isn't that just who God is? The God who pours life into death, who sees clearly into distress. Hagar was at the end of her rope, and she was in the desert, and she was in despair and in distress and on the edge of death. And God meets her and pours life into her and sees clearly through her darkness one he dearly loves, and he sets her back on a path of hope. And so Hagar goes back to Abram, and Abram becomes the man that he was supposed to be with his pregnant wife Hagar. He takes responsibility as a man and takes this son in his arms at the age of 86. He takes his son, his newborn son, and says, you'll be called Ishmael, which means God hears. And life is good for another 13 years. Because everything gets better, life goes on. It doesn't stay horrible forever. You have your crisis, you have your valley of death, and God finds you, and then you're picked up out of it, and life goes on, and everything's good. Right? The years go by, the wounds heal, the scars remain, but the pain dissipates. And things are better because God has found you. All is good, and it will stay that way. That's how it works, right? That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? Only that's not how it works. We know that's not how life on this earth happens, don't we? I mean, look at what's happening in the world around us right now. It's like we're all walking through a dark pit, and some of us more vocally than others are wondering, where is God right now? Does he see? Does he hear? And we get to the beginning of chapter 17, and we have this 13-year jump. And it clearly appears as though Abram and Sarai have resigned themselves to the reality that the heir of Abram's family will be Ishmael. And the Lord appears to Abram again and changes his name to Abraham. The Lord tells Abraham that he'll be the father of many nations. And he forms this covenant promise about how Abraham's descendants will be God's people and live in the land of Canaan as his eternal possession for them, which will eventually be known as the land of Israel. And then, in what appears to be comic relief in the story, God also changes Sarai's name to Sarah and says that she will be the mother of many nations, and kings and people will come from her. And in response, Abraham falls on his face and laughs and says, what child is going to be born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman? He chuckles, and it's as though he asks God to, be realistic, God. Why can't Ishmael just live with the special blessing? Let's be realistic. He's the son I have. Why can't it be him? And God says, no, it'll be Sarah. And it's as though God reminds Abraham that it was you and Sarah that I called out of the land of to come to here. I called you out of the land of your ancestors to come and live here and have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The promise has always been for you and Sarah. But in verse 20, God points out his awareness of how much Abraham loves his son Ishmael. And he says, I will bless Ishmael, and he'll be fruitful and multiply, and have many descendants. And he'll be the father of 12 princes and be a great nation. But my covenant, my promise is with you and Sarah. And so the story of Abraham continues, and Sarah becomes pregnant and gives birth to her son Isaac. And when Isaac is somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4, in Genesis chapter 21, verse 8, Abraham throws a party. They're all there. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Ishmael, and Hagar. And during this feast, the curtain is pulled back of 15 years or more of what it's been like for these people to live together. And you see the rift between Sarah and Hagar has never healed. The scars go deep, the pain remains, the hate is palpable, and it's flowed over into the attitude that Ishmael has for his little brother. And it's a behavior we still see today, the way parents respond to neighboring parents. Phrases that are picked up by children as they hear their mom and dad talk about their neighbors or those in their church. A behavior starts to shape the way the children will respond to those same people. And their kids too. If a parent talks well about a neighbor, kids will often think well of them too and maybe want to befriend them. However, if a parent is continually insulting and diminishing and criticizing someone on their street or in their church, the children will overhear it and start to think about the same things for them and their kids. And Sarah's had enough of seeing Hagar's face, of hearing the laughter of Abraham's other son, of sharing a roof with them, sharing land with them, and she wants them gone for good. So she goes over to Abraham, and without even using Hagar's name, she says, get rid of that slave woman and her son. They are never going to have a part of this inheritance with Isaac. I won't have it. And our translation says, drive her out. She's demanding Abraham to end this marriage with Hagar. Something only Abraham could do. Before she abused Hagar, so Hagar would flee, but now Sarah has a son of her own and she has more sway in what's going on in the household. And Abraham is torn because he deeply loves Ishmael as much as he loves Isaac. And God can hear the heartache within Abraham. And God tells Abraham and comforts him, don't be upset. The promise that I gave you and Sarah will be fulfilled through Isaac. But as for Hagar and her son Ishmael, because he's your son, Abraham, he too will be blessed and he'll be a great nation. So Abraham gets up in the morning so no one sees him, so he can have his privacy, and he finds Hagar and Ishmael, and he does what only he can do. First, he sends them away, which is an act of divorcing his wife Hagar. The second thing he does is he gives Hagar her freedom. She's no longer a servant or a slave, which means her son is also no longer a servant or a slave. But it also means that her child forfeits any inheritance rights. And it tears at Abraham's heart. And I believe it would tear apart the hearts of Hagar and Ishmael too. But in this act, Hagar is no longer the wife of Abraham. And Ishmael is no longer his son. And he gives him as much provisions as he can, bread and water. And just as the sun is dawning, Hagar and her teenage son wander aimlessly into the wilderness to the south. And we don't know how long it lasted, how long they wandered, but the water eventually ran out, and death was knocking at the door for Hagar and Ishmael. So she found a bush for shade for her son to rest under, so that it might be a little bit more peaceful as Ishmael dies. And she goes off about a football field's length and bursts into tears because she can't watch her boy die. And this is where one of the most touching paragraphs in the Bible appears, because the words here contain a deeper meaning than what our ears hear. In Genesis 21, 17 and 18, it says, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called out to Hagar from heaven and said, Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. Hagar is crying and weeping and bursting into tears. An arrow shot away, 100 yards away. Ishmael is crying too. They feel separated from the only family that they had left, and they're separated from each other, and they probably feel separated from God too. And in this passage, in these two verses, though Ishmael's name isn't used, Ishmael still appears. This passage is a reminder of the promise that God gave Hagar, a reminder to us as readers that a true Ishmael exists. Do you remember what Ishmael means? God hears. Every time Hagar said her son's name, Ishmael, from when he was a baby to when he was young and playing as a boy to when she walked with him as a teenager, she had this constant reminder before her: God hears. Ishmael. And in verse 17, it says, God heard Ishmael, the boy, crying. And the angel said, Hagar, don't fear, for God has heard Ishmael, the voice of the boy, Ishmael, and he knows where he is. Hagar, God is not deaf to you. God is not blind to you. God can hear your son, and God can see both of you. You believe in Ishmael, the God who hears. You are a child of Ishmael, the God who hears. The angel continues, I want you to get up, go to your son, comfort him, take him by the hand, because I have great things planned for him. Then it says God opened Hagar's eyes, her tear-filled, red, puffy eyes. And he showed her a well in front of her, a spring of water. They'd run out of water. They were parched. They were on the edge of death. Despair had taken over. And once again, God pours life into death and sees clearly into distress. He comforts them. He cares for them. He guides them. He is with them. Ishmael and his mother move farther south. He becomes an archer, which could have been used for hunting, or maybe he was a soldier or mercenary, a person for hire. He marries a woman from Egypt, and they have a family, and they do become a great nation. It wasn't an easy life for Hagar and Ishmael. It wasn't a life anyone could predict. But that's what life can be like. It can be inconsistent at times. But if there's one consistency in this story, it's that no one is perfect. Sarah is not perfect. Ishmael's not perfect. Abraham's not perfect. Hagar's not perfect. And some of you may be listening today and you can identify with parts of this story. Maybe you've experienced abuse, or you've experienced contempt, or you've experienced cursing, or maybe you've thrown a few curses around yourself. Some of you have those people who you just hate in your life. These people who you just can't seem to forgive, who you just can't get past it with, and they can't get past it with you, and the scars remain, and you see them, and the wounds flash across your mind, and the pain stabs at your heart, and the only way to get past them is to get away from them. Some of you know what it's like to have been at the end of your rope, to want to run as far away as you can, to just hide, or to curl up and wait to die. Some of you know what it's like to go through 15 okay years only to have it ripped away in the blink of an eye. Sometimes life just stinks and there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes it's because of the decisions we've made in our past, decisions that will stick with us forever. Sometimes these decisions will show up and drag us down to a pit that we feel like we can't climb out of. But some of you, I believe, also know what it's like to have the presence of God with you in that pit. Even in the depths, God still sees us. Even in the depths, God still sees us. God can still see us. God can hear us. God will hear us. God is still with us. Some of you know what it's like to cry out from the depths of your soul and have the confidence that someone greater than you is hearing and working out a plan for you better than you could imagine. Someone who loves you more than you ever know. A God who knows what it's like when no one can see what's going on inside. But the Lord who made you sees through it all, and He's your defender and your guide. We just went through Easter, and that's what the Easter story is all about, what the story of Jesus is all about. It's our story of our Lord who left the highest heights of heaven to climb down into our deepest pits, to see us and hear us and rescue us and pull us out. And Jesus is still with us, and we can hear him, and he can hear us. We can keep calling out to him, and he will keep hearing us. He will keep reaching down to pull us out, because we follow and we believe and we live in a world with a God of promise, with a God of hope, with a God whose arms are open, who is slow to anger and willing and ready to forgive all we've done if we'll only just turn to him. A God who's full of unfailing love and abundant mercy, of grace and power that will enable us to live through this life if we live it with him. No matter what life throws at us, no matter what we do in this life to ourselves, Hagar has shown us, Ishmael has shown us, Jesus Christ has revealed to us that we follow a God who will never give up on you, on me, on any of us. Because God has a hope, a promise, a plan for you, no matter who you are or where you are. I want to bless us, and I want to pray for us as we journey into this week ahead with the God who sees us and hears us. Our Lord, you're an all-knowing Father. You hear the cries of your children. Nothing that happens to us can ever escape your notice, and we praise you. We thank you that you're the Lord who runs after the weak and the helpless. You show us mercy in your plan for blessing in our lives. Lord, in our own life we have pride. We have selfishness, we have hate, we have cursing, we have abuse, things that we have done to others that might contribute to these circumstances we're going through. We confess them to you and give them to you and run to your arms for forgiveness and hope and love. So God, open our eyes to the ways you are protecting and providing for us, the ways you are protecting and providing for our children. And we ask you to help us live each day, not as slaves to law, but as children of grace. Amen. And Lord, be with you this week.